In 11 days, the auctioneer's notice would go up on Cragmoor Observatory's door, and Delphine Roark meant to be gone from Fenbridge long before anyone read it. That was the plan the morning her uncle Josiah stood in her father's shop and told the assembled apprentices that his niece could not be trusted with tools, let alone a business. The debt her late father had left behind, he said, gave him every right to sell what remained. Delphine said nothing. Arguing with Josiah in front of 6 apprentices would only prove his point. She left with her father's toolbox and a letter naming her sole heir to an observatory she had never seen, on her mother's side of a family Josiah had spent years making sure she never mentioned. She reached Cragmoor at dusk and heard, through the locked door, a mechanism turning steadily somewhere above her, gears meshing in perfect time. The building had stood sealed for 12 years. Nothing wound a clock drive that long without a hand returning again and again. Delphine picked the lock with a watchmaker's pick, stepped inside, and started counting backward from 11 days to however long she actually had left. The letter had come from a Truro solicitor named Hendra. 3 lines of dry, legal English she had read a dozen times on the coach. Elizabeth Travail Roark, deceased, had left her only child a freehold observatory on the Cornish coast, together with its contents, subject to no encumbrance the solicitor's office could discover. Delphine had never heard her mother's maiden name spoken above a whisper in her father's house. Josiah had made sure of that too. She had gone to Hendra's office first, before the coach north, more out of disbelief than hope. He was younger than she expected, sharp-eyed, with ink on 2 fingers of his right hand. "Your uncle came to see me yesterday," Hendra said, sliding a folder across the desk. "He wanted to know whether the debt against your father's estate might reach a property that was never part of that estate." "And what did you tell him?" "That I'd need to see proof of how the property came to you before I could say anything at all." He tapped the folder. "You'll want to bring back whatever papers exist at the house. Deeds, correspondence, anything with your great-grandfather's hand on it." She had not known, until that moment, that she had a great-grandfather with a hand worth mentioning. The iron key Hendra had given her was heavier than any door key had a right to be, worn smooth on one edge as though a thumb had rested there 1,000 times. A smaller brass key, tied to it with wax thread, bore no label at all. Delphine had turned both over in her palm the whole way north on the carrier's cart, past hedgerows and church towers, and finally the long gray line of the sea. The driver told her, unasked, that nobody went up to the old tower anymore, not since the last of the Travails died strange and alone in it. "Strange how?" she had asked. "Just strange," the driver said, and would not be drawn further. He clicked his tongue at the horse and said nothing more for the rest of the journey, as though the subject itself were bad luck to keep open on a public road. Now, standing in the dark of the entrance hall with the ticking somewhere above her, she understood a little of what he meant. The air smelled of oil and cold stone, not the dust of a true ruin. Someone had been here. Someone was still coming. She found a stub of candle in her father's toolbox and lit it with a match struck twice against the damp. The hallway floor was swept clear of debris in a narrow path leading to a spiral stair, though the corners still held 12 years of grit. She followed the path, one hand on the wall, counting the stairs the way her father had taught her to count the beats of a balance wheel, steady and low under her breath. At the top, a door stood slightly open onto the dome chamber, and the ticking grew louder, patient and enormous, like something breathing. Delphine stopped on the last stair and made herself listen before she made herself look. 11 days, she thought. Whatever this was, whoever kept it wound, she had 11 days to understand it, prove it was hers, and find out exactly what her uncle had spent 12 years trying to bury under a debt he claimed her father owed. She pushed the door open. The dome chamber was larger than the tower's outside walls seemed to allow, ringed with brass fittings gone dull under a film of oil and dust. At its center stood the mechanism itself, a squat iron drum studded with gears, turning so slowly that only by watching the shadow of one tooth against the wall could Delphine be certain it moved at all. A counterweight hung on a chain that vanished up into the dark curve of the roof. Nothing about the room looked 12 years abandoned. The candle guttered, and she cupped it with her hand and made herself breathe. She slept that first night on a canvas cot she found folded in a cupboard, too tired and too wary to wonder who had left it there. In the morning, sunlight through a cracked seam in the dome showed her the rest of the damage. Slates gone from the roof in a rough diagonal line, water stains spreading down one wall, a stair rail rusted through in two places. The observatory was, by any honest reckoning, exactly the ruin Josiah had called it. Only the mechanism disagreed. Fenbridge itself gave her no warmer welcome. She walked down into the village that afternoon for bread and news, and found both harder to come by than she expected. The baker's wife looked at her boots, her city coat, and the direction she had come from, and named a price for a small loaf that made Delphine's jaw tighten. "Staying up at the Travail place, are you?" the woman said. It was not a question. "I am. Folk here don't go up there. Not since old Peregrine." She said the name the way people said words they didn't like the taste of. "Died strange." He did, alone with his machines, and half the village said his mind went with his fortune. What fortune? The baker's wife only shook her head and took her coin. At the Anchor Inn, the landlady, a broad, unhurried woman named Mrs. Pascoe, was at least willing to talk, once Delphine had paid in advance for a room she could not really afford and did not, in the end, use. "You've 11 shillings and a toolbox," Mrs. Pascoe said, eyeing the case Delphine carried everywhere. "That won't buy you a new roof, girl." "I didn't come for the roof. I came to see what's mine." "Then you'd best find out fast. There was a man through here Tuesday, asking after the Travail Tower. City clothes. County Court Manor. Left a card for the constable. Mrs. Pascoe set a cup of tea down harder than it needed. "Whatever quarrel you've got, it's already walked in ahead of you." Delphine turned the words over on the walk back up the hill, the light already failing behind the headland. A city solicitor asking after Cragmoor before she had so much as unpacked her toolbox meant Josiah had known where she was going before she told a living soul in Truro. It meant he had likely known about the observatory for years, not days, and had simply waited for a debt claim broad enough to pry it loose. She hated how much sense that made, and hated more that she had no way yet to prove it wrong. Delphine did not sleep at the inn. She climbed back up to Cragmoor in the last of the daylight, telling herself it was only to save the shilling, and let herself back in with the heavy iron key. That night she lay on the canvas cot listening to the drive mechanism's slow tick, and somewhere past midnight she heard, unmistakably, the scrape of a boot on stone below her. She did not call out. She took up the candle and went down the spiral stair in her stocking feet, her heart loud in her ears, and reached the entrance hall in time to see the door swinging shut and hear quick footsteps crossing the yard outside. By the time she reached the door herself, there was only wind and gorse, and the black shape of the headland against a paler sky. On the floor just inside the threshold lay a small tin of clock oil, still warm from a hand. She picked it up and turned it over. No maker's mark, no name, nothing but oil worn into the seams of the lid from years of use. Someone had been climbing this hill in the dark for longer than she had been alive, tending a mechanism in a house that belonged, on paper, to no one at all. Delphine set the tin on the windowsill where she would see it first thing, and understood that whatever answers Cragmoor held, they were not going to come from Josiah's ledgers or Hendra's deeds. They were going to come from whoever still had a key. 2 days gone, and Delphine had spent both of them proving to herself that panic solved nothing. A plan couldn't solve better. She began with the workshop off the entrance hall, the one room with an intact roof and a door that still hung true on its hinges. She swept it out herself and hauled the worst of the broken furniture into the yard. Then she set her father's toolbox on a bench, scarred with 50 years of cuts and burns, not so different from the ones on her father's own workbench in Truro. By the second evening she had a fire in the small grate, a kettle that worked, and 4 shillings left to her name. She earned the 5th by accident. Reverend Nathaniel Prowse found her in the village churchyard, where she had gone to ask, without much hope, whether the parish register might show any travail baptisms. He was younger than his gray hair suggested, with the distracted air of a man who had lost an argument with something mechanical that morning. "You wouldn't know anything about clocks," he said, more statement than question, given where you're staying. "I know a great deal about clocks." He led her to the church tower without further explanation. The turret clock had stopped 11 months ago, he told her, at 3:20, and stayed there through 2 visits from a clockmaker in Bodmin who charged for his coach fare and did nothing useful with it. Delphine climbed the ladder in her skirts, swore under her breath at the state of the movement, and found the trouble within the half-hour. A broken click spring, easily replaced from the small stock of parts in her father's toolbox. 2 hours' work, she said, climbing back down. "I'll take whatever the parish thinks it's worth." Word traveled faster in Fenbridge than she expected. By the time she'd finished the church clock, a fisherman named Ezra Combe was waiting at the churchyard gate with his father's pocket watch, silent for 3 years and too sentimental to throw away. She fixed it at her workbench that evening while Combe watched, arms crossed, saying nothing until the second hand jerked back to life. "My father wore that watch the day he drowned," Combe said quietly. "I never thought I'd hear it going again." He paid her 6 shillings, more than she asked, and told 2 more men before Sunday. Others came more slowly, the way trust always did in a place that had learned to expect strangers to disappoint it. An old fisherman left a barometer with a cracked glass and no explanation. A woman from the harbor cottages brought a music box that had not played since her wedding, 20 years gone, and stood in the doorway wringing her hands until Delphine had it singing again. She mended what she could and refused payment for what she couldn't, and by the end of the week the workshop no longer smelled only of dust and cold ash, but of oil and brass polish, and the particular ordinary hopefulness of things being fixed. The boy came on the 3rd morning, before she had finished her tea. Tobias Pryor was perhaps 13, thin in the way boys get when there are more mouths at home than there is food. And he stood in the workshop doorway, holding a broken compass, as though it might bite him. "Mr. Combe said you fix things," he said. "I found this on the rocks. Thought maybe." She turned it over. The needle spun free of its pivot, an easy repair, the kind of small mechanical puzzle she had solved 1,000 times at her father's elbow before Josiah ever raised his voice at her in front of anyone. "Sit," she told him, "and watch where I put my hands. If you can tell me after why I did each thing in that order, I'll teach you the next one." He watched. He answered nearly every question right. By noon, he was pumping the bellows and sorting screws by size without being asked. And Delphine found she had, without quite deciding to, taken on an apprentice 3 days into owning a building she did not yet legally own. That afternoon, Reverend Prowse walked up the hill himself, out of breath, and found her oiling the church clock's cousin, the great drive mechanism in the dome, trying to learn its rhythm well enough to guess who else knew it. "There's a man asking questions in the village," Prowse said. "Says he represents your uncle's interest in the estate. Wanted to know how long you'd been on the property, whether you'd made any repairs, whether you'd claimed to have improved it." Delphine set down her oil rag. "Why would he care whether I'd improved it?" "Because a court weighs that," Prowse said. "For better or worse, Miss Roark, whatever this place is, someone in Truro has already decided it's worth fighting over." The man's name, Delphine learned by the end of the week, was Mr. Latham. And he did not come to Cragmoor himself. He sent a clerk with a letter instead, formal and cold. It informed her that the estate of Samuel Roark, stood indebted to the partnership of Roark and Price in the sum of £185. That sum, the letter claimed, was secured against all present and future property held in the Roark name or descending through it. The observatory, the letter suggested, plainly qualified. She read it twice at her workbench, then a third time to Tobias, mostly to hear how absurd it sounded spoken aloud. "That's not how debts work," Tobias said, with the flat certainty of a boy who had never owed anyone anything. "Is it? I don't know," Delphine admitted. "I know clocks. I don't know law." She wrote to Hendra that night and paid a boy from the harbor 2 pence to carry it to the mail coach before dawn. Then she went back to the dome, because worrying without working had never once fixed anything her father owned. And there was a mechanism upstairs that still had more questions in it than answers. She had begun, over the past days, to map the drive properly, the way her father had taught her to map any movement before she touched it. Every gear got counted, every worn tooth noted, every oil stain dated as best she could by its color and depth. What she found unsettled her more than the letter had. The mechanism's main spring housing showed tool marks far too clean for 12 years of neglect, fresh scratches layered over old ones, as though someone came to do far more than wind the drive, adjusting it, tuning it, coaxing it to run true. Whoever it was had also, at some point, oiled the hinges of a low door in the workshop's back wall that Delphine had taken, until now, for a blocked chimney flue. She found it only because Tobias, chasing a stray cat, put his shoulder against the wrong panel and nearly fell through. "There's a door here," he said, sitting up amid a small avalanche of dust. "It's not stone. It's wood, painted to look like stone." Delphine knelt and ran her fingers along the seam. The paint was old, cracked in a fine web. But underneath it, the wood had been kept dry and sound, protected from the damp that had ruined nearly everything else in the tower. A keyhole, small and recent compared to the tower's other ironwork, sat where a mortar joint should have been. The brass key. She had carried it, tied with its wax thread to the heavier iron one, for 11 days, without once trying it in anything. It turned on the second attempt. Behind the door lay a stair, narrow and steep, cut directly into the tower's foundation stone, descending further than Delphine had thought the hill allowed. Cold air rose to meet her, dry rather than damp, carrying a faint mineral smell she couldn't place. Tobias made to follow her down, and she stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Go tell Mr. Combe where I am," she said. "If I'm not back by dark, tell the Reverend too. You think it's dangerous? I think somebody's been keeping this stair a secret for a very long time, and secrets that old don't usually end quietly." She took the stub of candle from her pocket and struck a match against the cold stone. She started down, counting the steps low under her breath the way she had on the first night. At 40, the stair opened into a room that made her stop entirely still. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with shelves of instruments she had never seen outside her father's oldest trade catalogs. Half-finished chronometer movements, brass frames stripped to their bare escapements, drawings pinned in neat overlapping rows. Dust lay over all of it. Real dust this time. Undisturbed dust. The dust of a room nobody living had entered in years. She lifted the candle higher and let it move slowly across the shelves. Half-built movements sat beside jars of tiny screws sorted by thread, drawings of gear trains pinned 3 deep in places where paper had run short. A leather apron hung from a nail, exactly where a workman would leave it at the end of an ordinary day, as if its owner meant to return the following morning, and simply never had. The room did not feel abandoned so much as interrupted, a sentence broken off mid-word 50 years ago, and left waiting for someone to finish it. One workbench near the back had been wiped clean. On it sat a single brass and steel mechanism under a square of oiled cloth. Beside it lay an open notebook, and across its top ran one line in handwriting she somehow already knew was her mother's grandfather's. If they come asking whose invention this was, tell them the truth, whatever it costs you. Delphine did not touch the covered mechanism at first. She stood over it with the candle shaking slightly in her hand, aware of how much silence a room could hold, and made herself read the notebook instead, page by careful page, before she let herself hope for anything. The cold rising off the stone floor had already worked into her boots, and somewhere behind her, faint through 40 feet of rock, she could still hear the drive turning above. Peregrine Travail's hand was small and precise, an engineer's hand, and the early pages read like any workman's diary. Purchases of steel, notes on tempering, calculations of gear ratios that meant little to her, without more context. Then, roughly a third of the way through, the entries changed tone entirely. Roark has taken the third model to London, one line read, dated some 50 years past. He says the Admiralty men were much impressed. He did not say by what name. A later page, written in a hand grown noticeably shakier. E. Roark's patent, granted this month, escapement substantially as I designed it, my own name nowhere upon the document. I wrote to him. He did not answer. I do not think he will. Delphine sat back on her heels. Roark. Not a common name in Cornwall. Not one she'd expect to find twice by accident. She already knew, with the particular sickness of a fact arriving before she wanted it, exactly which Roark this was. He had gone to London with another man's invention and come home rich enough to open a shop in Truro that still bore the family name. The mechanism under the oiled cloth, once she finally drew the fabric back, meant little to her eye at first glance. It was smaller than she expected. A compact brass drum, no larger than 2 clenched fists, fitted with a balance wheel and an escapement of a design she did not recognize from any movement she had ever repaired. She lifted it with the same care her father had taught her for anything that might still be alive under the right hands. She turned it slowly and felt something inside shift and settle. The particular weighted click of a mechanism built to work, not merely to display. She wound it, gently, testing the spring's resistance with 2 fingers the way her father had shown her 100 times. The balance wheel began to swing, steady and even. A rhythm she recognized in her bones before she understood what she was looking at. A compensated balance, she realized slowly. One that would correct for temperature the way ordinary escapements could not, the exact flaw that made ordinary chronometers drift and lose ships their bearings on long voyages. She had heard her father complain about that flaw 100 times, had heard customers ask for a fix nobody in Truro had ever managed. Somebody in Truro had managed it 50 years ago, in this room. And somebody else had taken it away and put a different name on it. She thought of her father's voice, dry and careful, telling apprentices that a movements maker could always be read in the cut of its wheels, if a person knew how to look. She had never expected to use that lesson to read her own family's theft. Not proof, she told herself, forcing the thought down before it could run ahead of her. Not proof by itself, a working model and an old man's grievance, written in his own hand, in a room only she and whoever kept the drive wound could find. It would not stand alone in front of a county court judge who had never met her and owed her family nothing. She needed the other half of the story. Who had built this stair? Who had known to keep it hidden? And above all, who had been climbing up here in the dark for 12 years, tending a machine that ran perfectly, and a secret that apparently did not. She was still turning that question over when she heard, faint through the stone above her, the sound of the tower's outer door opening, and a voice she didn't recognize calling her name into the empty hall. She wrapped the notebook and the small mechanism together in the oiled cloth and tucked them inside her coat against her ribs. Then she climbed the 40 steps back up into the dust and daylight, already rehearsing, without meaning to, exactly how much of the truth she was willing to say aloud to a stranger standing in her doorway. The stranger turned out to be no stranger at all to Fenbridge, only to Delphine. He stood in the entrance hall twisting a soft cap in both hands. An old man, stooped, with the kind of weathered face that had spent 60 years outdoors, and the kind of eyes that would not quite meet hers. "You'll be Elizabeth's girl," he said. "I heard it in the village. I had to see for myself." "You knew my mother?" "I knew her father before her, and his father before that." He looked past her, up the spiral stair, toward the sound of the drive mechanism turning steadily overhead. "My name's Amos Pell. I was 'prenticed to Mr. Peregrine when I wasn't much older than that boy who fetched your bread yesterday." Delphine's hand found the shape of the notebook still pressed against her ribs. "You've been climbing this hill every night for 12 years. Amos did not deny it. He sat, heavily, on the workshop bench when she offered it, and told her the rest in pieces, the way old men tell things they have carried too long alone. He had promised Peregrine, in the last winter of his life, that the drive would never stop turning while Amos still had legs to climb the hill, whatever else happened to the tower or the family. He had kept that promise through Peregrine's death. Through the years, the observatory stood empty, through every rumor the village invented, to explain a light no one but Amos ever actually saw. "Why keep it secret?" Delphine asked. "Why not tell someone? Tell the parish. Tell my mother when she was alive." Amos's hands tightened on his cap. "Edmund Roark come up here himself, the autumn after Mr. Peregrine died. Told me plain that if word ever got out what was really built in that room below, he'd see me turned off every farm and boat in 3 parishes, and my family with me. I had a wife then. Children. I wasn't a brave man, Miss Roark. I was a frightened one who kept a promise the only way frightened men can, in the dark, where nobody would see me do it." Delphine said nothing for a moment. She thought of her own father, dead 2 years now, who had never once mentioned a travail fortune or a stolen invention in her hearing, and wondered how much of his silence had been fear too, rather than simple ignorance. Edmund Roark, Josiah's father. Delphine felt the shape of the whole thing settle into place, cold and clear, even before Amos finished. "Will you tell that to a court?" she asked. "Not to me, in this room. To a judge, with Josiah's solicitor watching you." The old man's face went gray. "Josiah's father is 30 years in his grave. Josiah's a different sort of danger, but he's danger all the same. He could ruin my grandson's chances at the boatyard with one word to the right man, and he'd do it smiling." Delphine understood, in that moment, that she was being asked to choose. She could press Amos now, use his fear against him the way Josiah had used it for 30 years, and walk into Hendra's office with a witness. Or she could let him go home to his grandson and his boat and his ordinary frightened life, and find another way to prove what the notebook alone might not be enough to prove. "Go home, Mr. Pell," she said finally. "Wind the drive tonight, same as always. I won't put your grandson's future in Josiah's hands to save my own case." Amos looked at her for a long moment, something loosening in his shoulders that had likely been tight for 30 years. "Your great-grandfather said the same sort of thing once, near the end. Said the truth could wait for a day it wouldn't cost anybody an innocent neck to tell. Then I hope he was right, that the day comes eventually." "It generally does," Amos said, rising slowly. "Generally later than a body would like." He left as the light was failing, and Delphine stood a long while at the workshop door, watching him make his careful way down the hill, one hand trailing the dry stone wall for balance. She had, she realized, just given away the one piece of testimony most likely to save her, for a boy she had never met, on the word of a man she had known for less than an hour. Her father would have called it foolish. Her father, she thought, had also spent 30 years too frightened of Josiah to ever ask what had actually happened to his own father-in-law's fortune, and look what silence had bought him. She went back inside, barred the door, and sat down with the notebook to see what truth she could prove without asking anyone else to risk what Amos had risked for 30 years already. The bailiff came on the 9th day, 2 men behind him, and a folded paper in his hand that he read aloud in the yard, without waiting to be invited further. By order of the county court registrar, this property is to be secured pending determination of a disputed claim against the estate of Samuel Roark, deceased. Miss Roark, you're required to vacate the premises within the hour. On whose application? Delphine asked, though she already knew. Mr. Josiah Roark's solicitor filed this morning. Says there's reasonable cause to believe assets on this property are being concealed or removed pending the hearing. The bailiff's eyes flicked, briefly, to the workshop door behind her. We're to seal the tower and take inventory. 11 days had become 9, and 9 had just become an hour. She thought, with a lurch of pure animal panic, of the notebook and the small brass mechanism. They lay wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard under her cot. The one place in the tower she was reasonably sure Josiah's men hadn't thought to look yet. If the bailiffs sealed the building and Josiah's people conducted the inventory, there was no version of events in which that mechanism survived the week undisturbed. Latham would call it evidence of concealment, or simply misplace it, or worse. I need an hour to gather my belongings, she said, keeping her voice level by main force. That's my right, isn't it? It is. She used the hour badly by any sensible measure, and well by the only measure that mattered. She wrote a hurried note to Hendra, sealed it, and sent Tobias running for the mail coach with instructions to wait for the driver himself and see the letter into his hand. She packed her father's toolbox, the notebook, and the mechanism into a false bottom, built from a drawer pried loose and refitted beneath her travel case in 20 desperate minutes. It was work that would have taken an hour done properly, and took 40 minutes done in terror. The storm arrived with the bailiff's inventory, as though the sky itself had chosen its moment for spite. Rain came sideways off the sea, finding the crack in the dome seam she had not yet had money to mend. By the time Latham's clerk had finished counting chairs and candlesticks in the entrance hall, water was running visibly down the spiral stair from above. The drive mechanism, the clerk said, consulting his list. We're to inventory anything of unusual value. It's an old clock, Delphine said. It turns the dome. It's not worth what it would cost to remove it. He went up anyway, and she followed, unable to stop herself, and found him standing beneath the great iron drum with rain now dripping steadily past the cracked seam directly onto the counterweight chain. He had no idea what he was looking at. She did, and she watched the water darken the old iron with something close to grief. This needs a roofer, not an inventory, she said. If that chain rusts through in this weather, your inventory will have one less item on it by morning. The clerk, to his limited credit, seemed to understand the practical argument better than any appeal to fairness. He noted the mechanism, noted the leak, and left with the rest of his men before full dark, having sealed the workshop door and the tower's main entrance with the registrar's wax, and a warning that breaking the seal was itself an offense. Delphine watched them go, rain running off her collar and down her spine. She made herself catalog what still sat safe inside her travel case rather than what she had lost. The notebook, the mechanism, and a dome above her that no wax seal could stop from turning. Delphine stood in the yard in the driving rain, locked out of the one place she had, in 11 days, come to think of as hers. A false-bottom travel case sat at her feet, and 9 days remained to prove a claim she was no longer even permitted to gather evidence for. Tobias found her there an hour later, soaked through, having run the whole way back from the harbor. The coach driver took your letter, he said, breathless. But Miss Roark, there's talk in the village. Mr. Latham's telling everyone your uncle means to have the auction moved up, on account of what he's calling your concealment tonight. 4 days, they're saying now. Not 9, 4 days, Delphine thought, staring up at the sealed door and the storm-black sky above the dome. 4 days to find a solicitor willing to move faster than any solicitor she'd ever heard of, and prove, without setting foot inside her own tower, exactly what her great-grandfather had spent his last years trying to say. Hendra met her the next morning in the parlor of the Anchor Inn, having ridden through the last hour of the storm rather than wait for a dry one, his coat still dark with rain at the shoulders. He read her hurried letter twice, then listened to the rest of it. The stare, the notebook, the mechanism now hidden inside a hollowed drawer in her travel case, without once interrupting. 4 days, he said finally, is not enough time to prepare a proper case against a sealed order. It might be enough time to prepare a different one. Meaning? Meaning your uncle's application claims concealment of assets belonging to your father's estate. But the notebook you're describing, and whatever that mechanism actually is, were never your father's property to conceal. They belong to Peregrine Travail, and by inheritance, to you directly, through a line Josiah's claim never touches at all. Hendra spread her mother's few surviving papers across the table, the ones Delphine had carried from Truro without quite knowing why. If we can show the court that the true dispute is Josiah's father's 50-year-old theft of a patent, and no debt claim at all, we change what the hearing is about entirely. Can you prove theft that old? Not alone. I'd need the notebook. I'd need whatever survives of the original patent application, if the Roark firm still has it filed anywhere in Truro. And I would very much need a witness who remembers Edmund Roark leaving this coast with someone else's invention under his arm. Delphine thought of Amos, of his grandson at the boatyard, of the promise she had made him 3 nights before in a room that no longer had a locked door protecting it. She had told herself then that the truth could wait for a day that cost nobody an innocent neck. She had not expected that day to arrive quite so soon, or quite so entirely out of her control. I know a witness, she said slowly. I don't know if he'll come. She climbed to Amos's cottage herself that afternoon, past the harbor and the boatyard where a boy with Amos's same stooped shoulders was already caulking a hull, and found the old man mending a net in the last of the daylight. The cottage behind him was small and neat, lobster pots stacked along one wall, a child's boot drying by the door that told her the grandson she had heard about was closer than she had realized. Amos did not look up as she approached, though his hands slowed on the net. She told him everything, plainly, the sealed tower, the shortened deadline, Hendra's plan, and what it would cost him if Josiah learned exactly who had spoken. Amos was quiet a long time, his hands still on the net. 30 years I kept that man's secret out of fear, he said at last. My grandson's near enough grown now to make his own way, whatever Josiah Roark thinks of my testimony. I reckon I've been a frightened man long enough, Miss Roark. Mr. Peregrine waited longer than I did to see his name cleared. Seems poor. Thanks to keep him waiting further. You don't have to decide tonight, Delphine said, though she was already grateful he had. Amos only shook his head and folded the net over his arm. A man my age doesn't get many nights left to decide things in. Better to use the one I've got. He came with her that evening. Together with Hendra, they spent the night by lamplight in the inn's back parlor, building an argument that might unravel 30 years of a family's fortune if the judge proved patient enough to hear it in full. Hendra obtained a faded patent application by messenger from the Truro registry the next morning, filed 50 years earlier under Edmund Roark's name alone. The notebook's account matched it page for page. Delphine read the application beside the small brass model still hidden in her drawer, and recognized it instantly as the same device, down to the shape of its balance wheel. 3 clues, laid side by side at last. A dying man's own hand, naming his invention and his thief. A working model built exactly as he described it, and an old apprentice's memory of a stranger's threat, 30 years unspoken. None of them alone would have moved a skeptical judge. Together, Hendra said, turning the papers carefully in the lamplight, they had at least a fighting chance of being heard before Josiah's 4 days ran out entirely. Delphine slept little that night, the small mechanism beside her on the table like a held breath, and woke before dawn, already rehearsing, word for word, exactly what she would say if Judge Pengelly gave her only one chance to say it. The Truro County Court sat on a Thursday, in a room too small for the crowd that had gathered once word traveled that a Roark family quarrel would be aired in public. Delphine stood at the front beside Hendra, her father's toolbox left behind in Fenbridge, but the small brass mechanism carried in her lap the whole journey down, wrapped in oilcloth she had not once let out of her sight. Josiah arrived with Mr. Latham and the particular confidence of a man who had never once lost an argument in this town. He did not look at her as he took his seat. He had, Delphine thought, likely never needed to learn how. Latham opened plainly enough, laying out the debt, the security clause, the observatory's belated appearance among Samuel Roark's assets, all of it delivered in the flat, practiced tone of a man who expected no real resistance. The judge, an unhurried man named Pengelly, who had clearly heard 100 debt disputes exactly this dull, seemed halfway to a decision before Hendra even rose. "My lord," Hendra said, "before this court weighs a debt against a property, I'd ask it to first consider whether the property in question was ever lawfully anyone's to encumber." He laid out the inheritance first, plain and unremarkable, Elizabeth Travail's line passing directly to her daughter, untouched by Samuel Roark's estate at any point. Latham objected twice, was overruled once, and Delphine watched Josiah's jaw tighten by careful degrees as the ground under his claim narrowed. Then Hendra called Amos Pell. The old man walked to the front slowly, cap in his hands, just as he had stood in Delphine's doorway. In the same plain voice he'd used in her workshop, he told the court of a promise made to a dying inventor and a threat made by that inventor's own patent agent. 30 years, he said. He had spent climbing a hill in the dark, rather than break either one. Josiah's face stayed composed, but Delphine saw his hand tighten on the arm of his chair when Edmund Roark's name was spoken aloud in a room full of Truro men who remembered the family well enough to weigh it. "This is an old man's fancy," Latham said, rising. 50-year-old grievances prove nothing in a matter of present debt. "Then perhaps the mechanism itself will prove something," Hendra said, and nodded to Delphine. She unwrapped the small brass device. With hands, she made herself hold steady, and set it on the clerk's table where Judge Pengelly could see it, beside the faded patent drawing Hendra had obtained from the registry that same week. She explained, as simply as she could, what a compensated balance was and why ordinary escapements failed at sea, and watched the judge lean forward despite himself as she wound the small spring and the balance wheel began its even, patient swing. "This was built," she said, "by Peregrine Travail, in a workshop below Cragmoor Observatory, some years before the patent bearing Edmund Roark's name alone was filed in this town. I have his own notebook describing the theft in his own hand. I have a witness who watched the threats that followed it. And I have the mechanism itself, which any competent clockmaker in this room can examine and compare to that drawing stroke for stroke." Latham glanced, for the first time all morning, toward Josiah, and found no instruction waiting in his client's face. Behind her, Delphine heard Mrs. Sy, Pascoe's unmistakable whisper carry 3 rows back, informing her neighbor exactly who the Travails had been and exactly what she had always suspected about the Roark fortune, whether she had said so aloud before that morning or not. "Mr. Roark," Judge Pengelly said, "does your firm hold the original working model referenced in this patent application?" The silence that followed answered before Josiah did. "It was never kept," Josiah said finally, and Delphine heard, beneath the careful courtroom calm, the first thin crack in 30 years of certainty. "My father built the firm on that patent. I inherited a business, not a confession." "You inherited a claim you knew was disputed," Pengelly said, not unkindly, and pressed it regardless. "Against a property you knew to be beyond your late brother's estate. This court will not enforce a debt secured against goods the debtor never lawfully held. Still less allow that debt to reach into a theft 30 years unaddressed." He set down his pen. "The application to sell Cragmoor Observatory is refused." I am further referring the question of the original patent to counsel better versed in such matters than this court. Mr. Roark, I'd advise you seek your own. Promptly. A murmur ran through the room, quickly hushed by the clerk's raised hand. Josiah rose without a word and walked out past Delphine so closely she could have touched his sleeve. He did not look at her. She let him go. The seal came off Cragmoor's door on a bright morning 9 days after the hearing, removed by the same bailiff who had put it there, with rather less ceremony than either occasion seemed to deserve. Delphine stood in the yard and watched him peel the county court's wax away. Something in her chest loosened, tight since the morning Josiah stood in her father's shop and called her untrustworthy in front of 6 apprentices who had once been, in a smaller way, hers to teach. The patent question took longer than the debt had, dragging through solicitors' letters for the better part of a year. Its ending was never seriously in doubt, though. Once the notebook and the model stood side by side, in front of men who understood escapements. The Roark firm's founding patent was formally disputed, then quietly amended to credit Peregrine Travail as originator. That correction cost Josiah the shop's reputation, and eventually the shop itself sold to settle what the courts determined he owed the Travail estate in unpaid royalty, compounding for 50 years. Delphine did not ask for all of it. She asked for enough to mend the roof properly, replace the rusted stair, and fund what Peregrine's own will had asked for. That will, discovered at last folded inside the back cover of his notebook, was plain enough. He wanted a school at Cragmoor for the sons and daughters of Fenbridge's fishing families, where navigation and timekeeping would be taught free to anyone with the patience to learn them. On the school's first morning, a dozen children climbed the hill. Amos had once climbed alone in the dark, carrying slates and borrowed pencils instead of oil tins. Delphine stood at the workshop door, counting them the way she had once counted stairs. Low under her breath, out of nothing but plain relief. Tobias was her first pupil in anything like a formal sense, though he had been learning at her elbow for the better part of a year already. Amos came up the hill less often now that the drive no longer needed a secret hand to wind it. But he came often enough, sitting by the workshop fire on winter evenings. There he told Tobias and the other children stories about a man he had loved and failed to defend for 30 years, and had finally, in his own way, defended after all. Reverend Prowse rang the mended church clock every Sunday now at the hour Peregrine himself had once kept for evening observations. A small private joke between Delphine and a man dead 60 years before she was born. Mrs. Pascoe, who had once eyed Delphine's 11 shillings with open suspicion, now kept a standing room at the Anchor Inn for visiting instrument makers who came, increasingly, to see the school and the restored dome for themselves. The dome itself turned true again by the second autumn, its counterweight chain replaced, its drive mechanism cleaned and adjusted by Delphine's own hands until it ran with the same patient rhythm Amos had preserved through 12 years of darkness and fear. On clear nights, the harbor below could set its lanterns by the observatory's lamp, lit now at dusk by whichever pupil had earned the privilege that week, a small, steady light where for over a decade there had been only rumor and a locked door. Josiah did not come to Fenbridge again, as far as Delphine ever heard. Some 18 months after the hearing, though, she received a short, unsigned note enclosing her father's own toolbox, the one she had left behind in Truro the day Josiah declared her unfit to hold it. She kept it beside the one she carried from her father's actual estate. 2 sets of tools from 2 different kinds of inheritance. Both, eventually, she gave to Tobias on the morning he passed his first real trial as a working clockmaker in his own right. She thought sometimes, winding the great drive by lamplight the way Amos had taught her to check its tension, of her great-grandfather's line in that first notebook. It was the line that had sent her down 40 stone steps into a room nobody living had entered in years. Tell them the truth, whatever it costs you. It had cost her, in the end, less than she had feared, and more than she had expected. It cost her a season of fear, and it bought her a friendship built on an old man's courage rediscovered years too late to save him and just in time to matter. She locked the workshop each night, now out of habit rather than secrecy, and left the key, both keys, hanging plainly on a nail by the door, where anyone who needed them could find them.